Welcome to the Practice Discipleship Training Initiative. My name is Dawn Troutman, and I am your host throughout this series. I'm from LutheranLifeCoach.com, and I am coming to you today from the New York Metro Synod. This initiative is a dynamic partnership between the ELCA Youth Ministry Network, the ELCA and its youth gathering, the seminaries and colleges, and resource providers for children, youth, and family ministries in the church. The goal of Practice Discipleship is to foster faithful, thoughtful, and intentional leaders in congregations who follow Jesus in their daily lives. The theme for this year is Faith Formation in a Missional Age. As you can see, there are a series of 7 webinars that focus on Lutheran theology, ministry theory, and practical skills relating to our theme. Today's webinar is Theories of Culture, a New Agenda for Theology, Ministry, and Faith Formation. Our presenter is Dr. Nathan Frambach, Associate Professor of Youth, Culture, and Mission, and Director of the Center for Youth Ministries at Wartburg Seminary in Dubuque, Iowa. Before we jump in, I just want you to take note that on the right side of the screen is a chat box. So keep an eye on that because you can type in questions that you have as Nate is talking. And when we get a good break in the conversation, we will jump in and I will repeat your questions to him so that you can hear some answers. There will also be some times when he specifically asks you for some responses, so be ready to jump in with those as well. So before we get going, I just wanted to welcome you, Nate. Thank you for being here.
Lovely. Glad to be here, and I'm glad to be inside in Iowa on this day because it's extremely cold here. It is really cold.
Good. Well, I love your topic, so I would love to just jump in if that's all right with you.
I'm ready to go, and thank you. Thanks for your facilitating this and everybody who's made it possible, and my virtual audience out there. I know there are some people who are probably listening now who are in a very warm place, and I envy you. So, yeah. So Theories of Culture, a New Agenda for Theology, Ministry, and Faith Formation. This was a topic that came to me. I was asked if I could maybe have something to say, figure out a way of addressing how we think about culture. And when I first thought about that, I was interested, of course, but it was, I thought this is going to be sort of a bit of a challenge because there are a variety of ways to think about what we mean when we talk about culture. So I thought, well, I have to pick an approach, and all of everybody who's listening to this, who's a part of this, has to figure out their own way of thinking about interacting with culture. But I thought, well, let me begin with some kind of assumptions that I have, or some assertions that I have that are really crucial when it comes to how I think about culture. And so there are three assertions that I need to put out there as we move forward so you can see the case that I want to make about an understanding of culture. The first is that the Christian gospel and culture, or cultures, cannot be separated. Two really important things in that first assertion that will help us as we move forward. One is that we are talking about a particular belief system, a particular religious persuasion, which happens to be Christianity, at the heart of which is the Christian gospel. So that's a claim connected in this first assertion to the reality that culture is not singular. It's plural. It's always plural. All of us inhabit a variety of cultures at the same time, simultaneously, and some of them are very kind of conventional in how we understand culture, more traditional, if you will. What I mean by that is ethnicity, race, geography, class, but then there are other certainly more intangible ways of thinking about culture that are more nuanced. So point being, my first assertion is that the Christian gospel and cultures cannot be separated. Second is that we live, human beings being we live in a pluriverse of cultures. That's a phrase that anthropologist Clifford Geertz would like to use that phrase a lot, a pluriverse of cultures, which basically means culture is not singular, and that we all inhabit multiple cultural contexts, if you will, cultural universes at the same time, although that makes it really big, doesn't it, Dawn? to think about multiple universes.
Yeah, I am already thinking about all of my cultures that I live in, let alone universes.
Yeah, well, let's stick with cultures and strike everybody out there. Strike the universes. We live in a lot of cultures at the same time. Thirdly, my third assertion is that congregations are one of those cultures. And so one of the things you'll find as we talk through this, this webinar, this particular approach to understanding culture is that I realized quickly, given these assertions, gospel and culture can't be separated. We inhabit a variety of cultures at the same time, and that congregations are one of them. Immediately I thought, you know, instead of trying to get at culture in some kind of really big, generalized, nebulous way, it's probably going to help us to specify it in terms of the way in which all of us are called to serve in ministry at some place with a bunch of people at some time. So I thought for the purposes of this way of thinking about culture, it would be helpful to assert congregations as the primary cultural context that we're going to be interested in for this conversation. So those are my three assertions that I think would help the listener understand sort of where I'm coming from. And I guess if I had to identify a goal for the webinar or the workshops that we've done, it would be something like this. It's an attempt to cultivate an understanding of culture that will support and serve faithful, truthful, and effective ministry in a missional age. I mean, I want it to go somewhere. I think all of us, the work that we do when we're engaged in study and reflection, it's certainly good to exercise our minds and to poke and probe around in the world of ideas. But I also think, you know, we want it to go somewhere, to sort of have some existential legs. And so I want the work that we do in trying to better understand cultures to support the way in which God calls us to ministry. And I think it needs to be faithful, of course, and of course we want to be effective in how we serve. But I also think, finally, it really needs to be truthful, and by that I mean that how we seek to understand cultural realities needs to fit. It needs to cohere with the way the world actually is around us. Not the way we wish it were, not the way it used to be, but truthful in that sense. So there's my, my goal, if you will, or my kind of purpose or thesis statement.
And I love that you're pointing people toward cultivating a culture. It's a new way of thinking, and I'm excited about where this is going. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Well, I mean, and because we all, you know, we inhabit cultures, but we participate in them. And human beings, we are just by nature, we're culture creators. And so I think it's important for us to understand that, for instance, in congregations, it's a culture that's comprised of people who come from a whole variety of cultures, and together we sort of create our own congregational culture. And it's not static; it changes. And we all inhabit it, but we also create it, and we change it. And so the word cultivate, yeah, I use that very intentionally because we need to figure out, I think, better oftentimes in our congregations how as a collective we can be more intentional and deliberate. That's the same thing, actually. I just used two words that mean the same thing. We need to be more intentional about, you know, thinking about our cultural context, reflecting on it, and also asking, you know, how can we continue to change it in a way that will serve our ministry better?
Great. So let's jump in.
Move on. There are three big realities that are going to be really important for us to address in order to see this through, at least in the way that I wanted to see it through. And everybody out there who's listening, you know, shoot me. I mean, you'll shoot me your questions soon enough, and I have some questions for you. But these are three big realities I think we need to consider in the trajectory I'm taking here. One, of course, is culture or cultures. I've said a little bit about that already, and we're going to come back to in a minute, but I want to at least list these three. The second is context. And yeah, I don't know, but if there are any Wartburg grads out there listening, you've probably heard the word context more than you ever want to, and I've heard that at other seminaries that's the same, which is good. But I was just talking to a couple of Luther Sem students in Anaheim, and they were like, oh yeah, we definitely get our fair share of context. So it's going to be real important to talk about context as a way to specify how we think about culture. And then thirdly, the third reality is narrative or story. And I'd like to finish today by helping us refine, how we think about culture by looking at context. And then as we've looked at the realities of our context, we then need to ask what particular practices can we use if we really want to understand our cultures, our cultural context better, to to sort of empower our ministry, then we need practices that help us do that. And so I've chosen this one. There are many, but I've chosen narrative or story. So those are the three big realities we're going to take a look at. And there's something else on this slide. There it is. So here's why. Thank you so much. Magician behind the slide turner. This is a quote that I want to share with everyone because I think it reflects the need or the reason to quickly move from a kind of big, broad, general discussion of culture to context. And it has to do with the cultural turn from text to context. So here's a quote that comes from a book that I've referenced in this webinar, this workshop. Scholars of religion have turned more and more to the interactions and relationships between religion and culture. And to do that requires embedding religion in its context. So there's been a really long a conversation that's been taking place for decades and decades about how it is that one best approaches and understands these big realities like religion or culture. And this language of the cultural turn from text to context I think is helpful because what it basically suggests is that if we really want to understand a specific religious beliefs or practices, for instance Christianity, let alone any certain varieties or traditions in Christianity, then we're going to have to get more specific. And Clifford Geertz, again the cultural anthropologist, talks about the importance of descending into detail if we're going to engage specific cultural context. So the turn helps us focus and specify so we're not working out in big, huge, broad abstractions where we're going to really look at, in this case, religion, for instance, in its micro context. And I'm suggesting for the work that we do that congregations are one of the primary micro contexts.
Wonderful. And congregations really are defining the story for the people who are active in that congregation.
Mm-hmm. Did you say defining?
Yeah, they're
right.
kind of telling a story about the culture.
Exactly right. They're exactly congregations are receiving, are inheriting and receiving a big story, a God story, a faith story within a particular tradition. For instance, within the Lutheran witness or a Lutheran witness, congregations receive the big story, and it becomes an ongoing part of their congregational context. And as they receive that story, they also have to figure out how to transmit it, how to pass it on, how to share it. And it does get changed. It does get, it gets enculturated, so that there is, hopefully, as it says in Jude, that faith once and for all passed on to the saints. There's a core, but how that core specifically finds and takes life in a particular congregation is, it is the work, the people that the collective does together.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So, so we're going to so how about what is culture? This is an opportunity for whoever might be listening in here, sitting cozily wherever you might be, coffee shop, living room, maybe even on the beach. Oh no.
With Wi-Fi.
Oh, with Wi-Fi, yes, with a nice little Wi-Fi extension. Somebody's got their iPhone set on their thigh. We're going to talk a little bit about culture, but I'd like to start here by asking everyone, either on your own or if you happen to be with someone, talk to a neighbor. And what is culture? Here it is. First point. Let's hit it. So really, it's the topic, culture, discuss. That might sound sort of odd, but that's what I want you to do. Second point is going to help you a lot more. Chris, please. Dun, dun, dun. Yes, the question is, so if you're wondering, what does he want us to do? Is he asking us to do something? How cold is he? Is he really that cold? What is culture, friends? I'd like you to take just a minute or two and think a little bit. If you're by yourself, just think, how would you define, how would you respond to this question? What is culture? And if you happen to be with someone, then ask them and listen.
Wonderful. And as people are writing in their answers to the question, what is culture, we have a question from Kari referring a little bit to the last slide. She asks, do you mean we are going to look at why we do different parts of our religion? For example, the confession and forgiveness during a worship service?
Not necessarily. I mean, we could. I'm not thinking of it. I'm not thinking about it that specifically, at least right now. That's we certainly could do that. I mean, look at those really at kind of micro practices. But in some ways, a broader point, for at least this point in our conversation, is that those small practices like that, they differ from place to place, from congregation to congregation, precisely because every congregation is and has its own culture. So there might be these kind of stable pieces, say, that are part of the liturgy that find life or that take life differently in different places. That's because congregations have a different culture. And the cultural context is a part of what I think leads to some of those differences. That's why you go to one place and you experience a liturgy in this way, and you go to another place and it's like, wow, this is Lutheran, but that was really different. There are a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
One of them is a cultural reason.
Wonderful. So somebody wrote in, down in Florida, culture includes enjoying a 70-degree Sunday afternoon in February. Thank you. But seriously, culture includes values and core beliefs that create a central communal identity.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. That's comment, statement, or question? Because I let it stand.
I let it stand. They're answering the question. Thank you. And then Laurie wrote, a group of people who have similar beliefs and social structures is how she defines culture. Thank you, Laurie. And then Laurie also wrote, a particular frame of reference in which stories are transmitted and shared with a core ideology. Thank you.
Oh, that's nice. Ideologies, that's a great word to use too. That was Laurie?
Yes.
Yeah, that's ideology is really crucial when it comes to what I think is sort of the black box, the central control box of any culture, and that's its worldview. There's always an ideology of some kind of an ideology connected to a worldview. So that's a super good point.
Wonderful. And Dave, who Laurie and Dave are both in Minnesota. Dave wrote, culture includes attitudes and behaviors, which I would possibly say is in a context also. And Dave, I'm just going to scroll because I think you wrote two things, or maybe not. Okay, culture is in a place, a time, a society. Everyone's wanting to write in the degrees. It's 9 degrees in Alexandria. Thank you. You're responding to the person in Florida. And then Karen wrote, culture is everything that makes us who we are. Karen, bold statement. I love it.
Nice. Yep.
Good.
It is yeah, go ahead, Dawn.
No, those are kind of our answers for now. If you want to keep popping forward, and I'll go back.
Beautiful. So, thank you all so much, because a lot of people, regardless of the weather, are thinking very well, which is it's great, because there's some super good answers. I'm gonna connect a couple of those dots in a little bit, but you'll see my next point on my slide might be a moot point for those of you who are listening in here, because maybe it wasn't so difficult for you. You know, in other conversations I've had or workshop settings, you know, this was sort of tough. It's like, how do you talk about culture? Where do you start? You know, what do you ask when you're talking about culture? And it can be frustrating, because it is to just lay it out like this: culture, discuss. You know, oftentimes there are some anterior questions like, which culture? The notion of culture, I mean, it sort of is inherently abstract and nebulous. I mean, we can talk about it, but which culture, whose culture, where do we start, what do we ask? So if you look at any variety of kind of textbook definitions, you'll see a lot of textbook definitions that may or may not be helpful. So the point here, in some ways, everybody, folks, and thank you for engaging this, was really to problematize the fact that though we can, as you've evidenced, we can talk about culture, it's not always that easy to start there.
Wonderful.
So
we have 2 more quick definitions. I want to give everyone a shout out because I love that you're participating. Manda wrote that culture is the accepted set of normatives, and Michael wrote that culture is the web of human behavior, oftentimes unnamed, unidentified, but culture is a collective assumptions and behaviors. Thank you.
Yes, that's so right. That is so true. And we're going to get to why a lot of the words that folks are using here, why they're so important. When it comes to especially shifting from culture to context, which doesn't leave anything behind. It's just, I think it just helps us understand culture, you know, more for the sake of the ministry in our lives, because it specifies it. So anyway, yeah, I'm getting ahead of myself too, but this is really great. So next, this is why I think I'd like to move on and beyond just generalized or decontextualized attempts or understandings of culture. Because, you know, unless you're writing a textbook, they tend to just not be really helpful. I mean, again, if you think back to the purpose or the goal of the workshop or the webinar is to really help empower our call to ministry. And so if there are textbook writers out there, and there might be, then some of you are onto some good stuff. But secondly here, my next point is that you know, asking somebody to describe their culture just out of it, just cold, is like asking a fish to describe water. You know, that's an old joke. And now the assumption, of course, is that you can find talking fish. But if it's hard to see it when you're in it, and beginning at that point is sometimes it's difficult and not always easy. But here is another definition, and it has pieces of things that I heard from a lot of people who responded. This is Nancy Ammerman, who was the editor of a really super helpful book called Studying Congregations. I'll reference that a couple of times today, especially Chapter 7 in Studying Congregations. It has some really great tools for pastoral leaders, for practitioners, when it comes to things we can do to help better understand our cultural context. Her quote is that culture includes all the things a group does together. Culture is who we are and the world we have created to live in. It is the predictable patterns of who does what and habitual strategies for telling the world about the things held most dear. I mean, you can hear echoes there in a lot of the things that people shared back.
Yes.
So I want to move beyond dictionary.com when it comes to trying to understand or define culture. And again, Clifford Geertz used to emphasize the importance not only of descending into detail, but that any road to truly understanding a culture has to run through the particular. And that's what he meant by descending into detail, is that it's going to be very difficult to truly, really understand something well if you stay in generalities, and you need to get specific and get particular quickly, and that's what we're going to do.
Great.
Or you can think about it like this: Shrek was right. That, like ogres and onions, cultures also have layers. A lot of the things, it's interesting because a lot of the things that people included in their definitions are actually points where you start if you really do want to try and understand a culture. I mean, I just think back a minute ago, somebody used the language of customs or behaviors. I mean, if you have a kind of cross-cultural encounter, those are the kind of things that you're going to notice first. You know, you're going to notice the things, if you will, on the outside layers, what you see, behavior of people, sure, but even like more specifically, I mean, smells. It's the tastes when you're enjoying food with other people. It's the symbols, the pictures, the images that you see. All of those are kind of outer layer things that you're first going to notice before you can get deeper into, say, ideology or worldview. And what else have I got here, Chris? So that's why I think it's real important for us to shift our attention to particular cultural contexts, and specifically for the sake of, I would guess, most of us who are a part of this conversation, that context is going to be congregations, Christian communities. Now, not everybody probably is going to be serving in a congregation, but I would guess that most folks listening herein are. Don't you think so, Dawn?
Yeah, I mean, we do have a few people who are in other ministry settings like camps and you know, other nonprofits, but they definitely are a part of congregations if they are in that role.
Right, and good. That's good. And so I also want to just be clear that I think that what we're doing here applies just as much, say, to an outdoor ministry setting, to a camp, as it does to a congregation or a campus ministry setting. So,
and camps are all about the rituals and the sounds and the smells. Camps are masters of that.
Absolutely. Yep. So now we're going to shift, everybody. Just so you know, that was my in the kind of first part or the first move in the conversation. I wanted to sort of certainly identify and address the reality of culture, but and to suggest, yeah, we could. It's very possible to talk about culture in a more general or abstract way, but that for the purpose here, this approach I'd like to take, I want to specify it and do that by turning now to another topic. If you remember from the beginning, big three realities. The second of those big three realities is context. And so here's another topic for you, for everyone out there, if you would please, on your own or with a friend. I have another question for you. Describe your ministry context. So I'm talking about the social context of your congregation, your camp, your campus, community, and the neighborhood, the larger community, but also the congregation itself. So think a little bit when I use the language of ministry context, I'm really thinking about both the congregation, the camp, the campus, and its environments. Maybe not in its neighborhood environments. And be specific when you think about how you would describe that. This is especially good if you can talk to somebody. Of course, it's great to hear back from you anyway. But
great, and please write those into the box.
What's that?
We do have a comment, and please write those into the box, a few of their contexts, so we know who we're talking to.
Yeah, right. That's awesome. That would be good to sort of see where we're at.
Right, with the people who are on live with us. Back when you were saying that this applies to all different kinds of ministry, David wrote, it sure does. So thank you for backing us up, David. It does apply to a lot of different contexts. We'd love to hear what contexts that people are in. I do think about sometimes the context of the congregation does not match the larger neighborhood. Have you ever experienced that?
Absolutely right. That is absolutely right. And that, that often, as many of us well know, that's a reality in locales and areas where the congregation is long established and its larger environment, its neighborhood setting has changed. And the congregation doesn't always change along with it. It certainly can work the other way around, but I think more often than not, it's the neighborhood, if you will, the smaller community around the congregation that has shifts, maybe demographic shifts.
Yes.
That the congregations have a hard time figuring out how to respond to that, how to remain connected to shifting demographics.
Right, right. So we do have a couple answers about context. David wrote, it is an attitude and behavior of extreme hospitality and Christian fellowship. And Manda wrote, she's in a rural community, operates 60% suburban and 40% rural. Half of us are longtime farmers and descendants thereof. The other half are business people who work in San Francisco, California, or the Bay Area and needed an affordable place to live. Fascinating connection. And then Laurie wrote, we are serving a rural small town, a traditional congregation in a multiracial community in northwest Minnesota. Thank you.
Wow. So, I wish I would. So, gosh, Lori, so those are basically three very distinctive kind of contexts that you're serving.
And Laurie, please write back, and I'll share. Michael wrote that he's a university town with families, large, middle, upper middle socioeconomics, plus university students. Thank you, Michael.
Good. So, see, we have campus.
Yeah, we have a lot of campus. Stephen also is at Purdue University, so he has students, faculty, staff, congregations of the Indiana-Kentucky Synod.
In the Indiana-Kentucky Synod, yeah. And so so I mean, think about both the confluence and the collision of cultures that takes place in a campus setting like that. I mean, you said Purdue University?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Oh my gosh, I mean, so you have a big university with, big student population, staff, faculty, and then a variety of different campus ministries, I'm guessing. And then,
yes. And Michelle is maybe in a different part of the spectrum, that she has highly skilled retired adults ranging from rocket scientists to military people. So David asks, does culture equal context?
Yes, it does. Culture, well, pop this next link, or next bullet for me, Chris. So my guess is that, oftentimes that responding to a question about context and talking about a person's context often goes a little easier than conversations about culture, because although they are, in a sense, what was David's question again?
Does culture equal context?
Yeah. Context, I think contexts embody and reflect culture. I think contexts show microcultures at work. Context shows what a culture looks like as it lives, and not just as we think about it or as we try to describe it, but as it lives and as it lives together. You know, if one way of thinking about faith is of thinking about church is that it's the faith as it lives together, and culture, cultural contexts are the places where the faith lives together, where the faith makes its way each day, each week, up and down, in and out, joy and tears. I mean, so there's a way in which, yeah, I don't think in some ways they're not the same, but there's a symbiotic relationship between culture and context.
Wonderful.
And that is a very convoluted way of trying to answer David's very fine, short question.
Yeah, that it was helpful. I'm going to just share with you, Stephen was the person at Purdue, and he added to what you were saying in that he also has a huge international student population. So that's another layer.
Yes, yes.
Karen wrote that she has several middle school and high school small group ministry, and within a congregation that, like many, is aging, also in her work in special ed in a public school. All are her trying to live in response to the gifts and grace she's been given by being God's hands and feet in the world. Thank you, Karen. Lori was the person that you asked if she's serving 3 types of ministries because she has the rural and the urban and a multicultural, and she wrote, yes, she's up in Lake Country.
Wow.
And then Michelle wrote that she has a larger congregation with lots of adults and fewer children and youth. It's a middle upper class community 1 hour from Disney, which definitely influences their culture and their community.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Thank you all.
You can go with that, Chris. That's all right. Yeah, those are great. I mean, this is beautiful, but I love this because in my mind, or on the blank wall right here, I'm just sort of picturing a map of this country, these United States at least, and where these folks are. And this is really cool because it gives me even a very faint mental image of who we are today. That's very cool. So, yeah. So, I'm typically, when we talk about context, it's a little easier to get some purchase there when it comes to how we talk about it, how we describe it, because at the end of the day, they're more specific. And for the most part, when we really have the time, especially face-to-face, to talk to somebody and describe them, it's really like telling a story. That's what we're doing. So I wanted to shift us to thinking a little bit more now about culture vis-a-vis context, and specifically congregation as cultural context. And in order to do that, yeah, this is just a quote. I think we can just, I'm just looking at our time. I don't want to really, people can access this, right?
Yes.
They want to?
Yes.
We'll let you all just sit on this quote at some point if you want. It's from the book Studying Congregations, that is about, congregations as cultural contexts. But what I'd really like to do is move on to the next slide.
Great.
And this descending into detail part when it comes to thinking about culture as context, congregational context. So I think in order to do that, and this is sort of going to get fun, was it David who asked that nice question about culture and context?
I believe it was. You're getting a lot of credit, David. Yes, it was David.
I just want to hold, because this, I think, is going to help us plow that ground a little bit more. To shift, to think about culture vis-a-vis or as context, as congregational context, I think it involves 2 really important things for leadership and ministry, for all of us. It doesn't matter who we are, where we're called, what title before our name, whether there is a title before our name, after our name, as baptized daughters and sons of God who are called into ministry. Focusing on context is going to mean 2 things. First, it's going to mean moving beyond what I call a theology as projectile view of context, of congregations. And what I mean by that is that one way of thinking about context and about a congregation as a context is that basically it's a target. And there's really no theology that's produced there, but rather there are theologians, quote unquote, who are trained to bring the theology, and the task is to aim really well. You know, so it's like you get the outside experts, you get your professionals, your consultants who come in and basically say, here's some really good theology, we're going to aim really well, really understand you, and hopefully hit our target. I just think, to use the old Saturday Night Live line, that's stinking thinking. Because here's the thing, every congregation, every congregational context is steeped full of theology that manifests itself in practices. Again, way back at the beginning, someone asked about the question that was about like micro practices. Those practices reflect the theology that's in our congregations. And so I really believe that God has placed all the wisdom, all the resources that a congregation needs in the place, in the people. And so it's not about getting people who bring the theology and aim really well, but rather it's about unearthing what's there. It's about extracting the theology and understanding what it is that we believe, who we are as a people. So this is one thing that I think is going to be important for leadership and ministry, to really claim the fact that God has placed wisdom and resources in the people, in the place. We have to unearth it. And that means we have to figure out how to be careful, how to slow down, and not to impose something on it. I think one of my old teachers, Raleigh Martinson, used the language of a hermeneutic of suspended judgment. Sometimes we have to suspend what we think we know. And especially when we're a part of something, right? I mean, we're all a part of cultures. We're all a part of congregational contexts. And some of us, we've been there a while. We're intimately connected. And there are a lot of things, face it, we think we know certain things. It's like when you hear a sermon and the text is one of the real, like the Good Samaritan, or, I don't know, John 3:16, or what else, Dawn? I mean, the really well-known biblical story.
Right.
Zacchaeus. It's like there's a way in which there's a temptation to sort of automatically think, oh, okay, I got this. I know this. We've heard this, heard it preached on. And we have to figure out how to sort of stop, pause, say, no, I need to be open to what I might not know, whether it's about a text or about this place that I inhabit. So in order to really claim that there's theology embedded in a congregational context, we have to be able to resist the temptation to impose what we think we know on it, and in order to do that, we need tools. And I think we need some tools from the social sciences that help us slow down, and that help us be intentional at asking questions and exploring the place that we're a part of, so we can better understand it. This is again where I would reference that book, Studying Congregations, because especially Chapter 7 has some really great tools. Now, on the slide here, you'll see I've listed things like ethnography, congregational timeline, interviews. I mean, you know what? This is language for things that we most of us do anyway. It's kind of social scientific language for stuff that we typically do. We just might not always call it the same thing.
Right.
But yeah, do you have a question?
No.
Okay.
I do have an example if you want it. So
Sorry,
the prodigal son, the prodigal son, one of those super common stories, hearing that preached in New York City, where a lot of people, especially in Lutheran churches, are people who are displaced. They came to New York, they didn't grow up here. So the prodigal son, he started with, you all are the son that ran away to the city, so let's start there, which is a really surprising shift, but he knew his audience.
That's nice. See, and again, knowing your audience is about knowing knowing your context, knowing your audience go hand in hand. They work hand in glove. So that is a super fine example. I want to just suggest that for most of us, myself included, and most of us, these kind of tools, it's a new skill set for many of us, but these are skills that can be learned. If we really believe that as a collective, it's important for us to understand ourselves for the sake of the ministry to which we're called. There are things we can do to help that understanding, and that the process of doing it is probably at the end of the day more important or more valuable than actually any results or information we get. So let me just use an example, the congregational timeline. You know what that basically looks like? It looks like some leadership gathering the generations for a part of a Saturday potluck. or some kind of a meal. You got to have food, and if you're Lutherans, you got to have fare to meddle and coffee, right? So, but you know, you get the generations together, and you're basically asking, what is our story? Who are we? We want to better understand who we are so that we can pass the story on to the generations that follow us. And so, you know what? You get a room and you get a lot of white paper, or you have a room with a full wall whiteboard or whatever it might be, and you just start asking people to tell about their earliest memories, and you're creating basically a timeline. You have at the very, very far left or right side the date the congregation started, and at the very other end you have the current date of that day. And the people together sort of fill in the middle based on what they can remember, based on stories they've heard. And it's a really cool intergenerational exercise, and you're not going to sort of do it and complete it in a day, but the process of doing that together is a beautiful, beautiful ministry.
I love that. Kari thought she may have an example for us, for you to kind of unpack. She wrote, like, when an interim comes to a new church and decides not to change everything right away because of the church's culture, which might be different than the pastor's culture.
That is spot on, as the Brits would say. That is money. That's exactly right, and that's why this. You said this was Kari?
Kari.
Yeah, and I mean, I've not served as an interim, not been trained as an interim, but my gut, my instinct tells me that is absolutely right. Because, you know, in some ways, just to use common parlance, we have to know what do we have to work with, and we have to know what we have to work with when we join a place, because we're all joiners when it comes to leadership and ministry. And you know, the only way we're going to really get to know who these people are, what their history is, what the culture's like, is by not rushing to things, and to paying attention and noticing things and listening and asking and listening. And did I say listening? You know, and again, so Kari, I think that's exactly right. But what that does is, it certainly helps the pastoral leader, whoever the leader might be, but it builds trust in the process. It's huge trust capital gain there when you come and you just try your best to honor and respect the people and listen as you join them.
Wonderful. And Kari said she hasn't been trained as an interim either, but she is a pastor's kid, which gives you a little bit of insight at least.
Yeah, well, that's beautiful. All right, so let's next slide, if you will. I just have another. You know, I talked about the congregational timeline, but ethnography is a fancy social scientific word, and a lot of this stuff we just don't have the time to get into. But at the end of the day, ethnography. Next bullet. There's my resource again. Next bullet. Yeah, there we go. That bullet. Ethnography. I mean, here's a kind of $10 definition. It's a focused, disciplined attentiveness to a context with the goal of understanding it better. It sounds good. Probably got that from a book somewhere. In fact, I probably got it from the book that's referenced right above there. But, next bullet, it's really just a kind of holy listening. You know, it's a kind of listening that pays close attention to the people who inhabit the place and to their stories and the narrative that basically, that eventually kind of unfolds a narrative of who we are as a people of God here in this place. So, you know, you can call it ethnography, or you can say, you know what, we're just really committed to holy listening because we like to pay attention to who we are and what God is up to here, and we believe that, you know, that's an important spiritual practice, an important spiritual discipline.
Thank you. Stephen wrote, with culture, perception is reality, and leaders have the best position to shape perception from the pulpit or lecterns we inhabit. Thank you, Stephen.
And you know what? So I'll say on the one hand, it's a great insight, and that's a large part of what it means to lead. And we can do what Stephen just identified, I think, more effectively if we're also listening, if we're also paying attention, and we got sort of the proverbial ear to the ground, because then we're able to, in some ways, to receive, process, and feed back information that we've heard. Maybe not tit for tat, but yeah, leadership is taking what we receive and helping to refine it in such a way that we can influence the perception. Yeah. All right. So, so culture, we've specified our focus when it comes to culture by I think we've specified it by focusing on context, and specifically on congregational context, or whatever our ministry setting might be, campus, camp. I think that's a helpful it helps to focus it, to refine it. But I have one more piece I wish for us to explore, and this is the reality of narrative, or as Dan Erlander years ago said, storied living. And so I have one more topic for discussion, and this is story. And I'd like to ask everyone to respond to this. Replace congregation with camp, with campus, but talk about your congregation's story. Tell a story about the congregation where you serve. Tell a story about a significant ministry experience that's connected to wherever it is that you serve.
Wonderful. I'm very excited to hear these stories. Stephen did just write, he was the one a moment ago saying how culture perception is reality, and leaders shape that from the pulpit or lectern. And in response to your answer, he wrote that leaders do decide where to shine the spotlight. Yeah. Even as they're listening.
Yeah, they do. And so, because I'm intrigued by this, and I think that's very insightful. I would like, if Stephen wants to, is there a caution? Yeah, is there a caution that's built into his insight or not? I'm just curious.
Yeah. Right there, that was all. I shared everything you wrote.
He might come back and help me out here.
I'd love it. And Stephen is the person at Purdue, just to
He's at Purdue? Sweet.
Maybe you could find him. You could have a discussion afterwards.
I have a feeling, I've been making notes about the geography here. I have a feeling I'm going to be trying to connect with a number of these folks.
Right. You all sound interesting. So please continue writing in. Michelle wrote, on Sunday, our congregation voted to merge with a congregation that is on the verge of closing as a way of reviving it. This will for sure be an instrumental event in this congregation's story. Wow, Michelle, you're right at the crux of a big turn in the plot point.
That is so right. That is, wow. Yeah.
You probably had your annual meeting last week.
What's that?
They probably had their annual meeting last,
That's a big step. Yeah.
A very big step. I'd love to hear stories from anyone else when they're ready to write in. Where is your congregation at, Nate?
We worship here in Asbury, which is is there a suburb of Dubuque? I don't know. People, it's a little village. It's on the west side of Dubuque, and Lord of Life is where we worship. It's one of 7 ELCA churches in the greater Dubuque area. Wonderful. So Lord of Life is in, and we had our annual meeting last week, and I missed it because I was in Anaheim. But what was just described a bit ago, that is a big step. It's risky. It's courageous to merge, to come together, and to, in some ways, to end life, to give life by ending life.
Right. And another question came in, are we talking more about reviving Michelle's congregation or reviving the closing congregation? What that'll mean for all those different groups of people. Right.
Well, and this is, and that's where people who are a part of this now certainly are going to have different, they have different realities based on where they were in terms of how they move forward, huh?
And what are your thoughts on bringing those stories together? Your idea about story and congregational timeline could really work well as you bring, the group. One group is absorbing another group right. Feels like they've lost their history to some level and need to graft themselves into another story.
It's interesting. It's very interesting that example, that ministry moment was shared in light of the example that I used of the congregational timeline, because either in studying congregations or in the earlier version of the handbook for congregational studies, that's an example that the authors used about when a timeline exercise can be really, really helpful, is when you have churches coming together for whatever reason, a church that's closing, that's merging, or a different kind of a merger. Like a combined or yoked ministry, that a timeline exercise can be very helpful and very timely because you're helping create space where everyone can honor the past, their past history, but also have this sense of we're now coming together to begin to create a new history together. And in some ways, once you reach that point, you can sort of, you have to deal with some feelings probably and talk through some things, but you sort of, you know, I lost me. What's something, the playing field? What's that?
Leveling.
Level the playing field. Thank you.
Yes. So Michelle did clarify that it's both the vision, it'll help, that it will, by putting these congregations together, it helps in both contexts. And I do have some other stories. I love the stories. Manda wrote that her congregation has had at the center of its narrative their 32-year pastor. Now it's 2 years until his retirement, and we're feeling the realities all at once. We live in the midst of now and not yet. Their identity is open, affirming, service-oriented, and the best part of the West Coast openness. The hope is we can amplify that and thrive in this transition. So she sees herself in a culture of Pastor so-and-so's church, and the story is built around a person. And I want to just share from Jeff and Stephen, and you can kind of, you know, make some comments after their stories. Jeff wrote, the congregation of which I am a member made a conscious decision many years ago to remain in the inner city. This has led to a multicultural ministry unlike any other in this city. Stephen wrote, back to the conversation that we were having about his context at Purdue, there's no caution that he has just observed leaders create a culture of positivity by listening and reflecting back the positive stories. Stephen has observed leaders foster a culture of negativity and can't do by doing just the opposite. Big question for soul searching. What do I gravitate toward, positive or negative? Thank you. And Laurie wrote, this congregation was formed in the 1950s as a merger of 2 Norwegian and 1 Swedish Lutheran church. Today it has members who are Latino, Laotian, and biracial, as well as members who are of a Northern European descent or heritage. We have members of every economic class. Our story is changing. We're living a story about a new diversity, and there's a continuing story of tearing and mending. Our mission is to love, go, and heal. Thank you for all those stories. That's what we have at this point.
Okay, well, let me tell you what I'd like right now. I'd like all these people to be right here in the lower level of my house. So we can have a little something to eat and continue to tell these stories before the Super Bowl comes on. That's what I'd like. That's some beautiful stuff there. Seriously. So, okay, so here's the thing. You see how rich, how quickly, in whatever the environment, whether we're together in the same room or whether we're virtually connected, stories are rich, right? And I really want to conclude what the time that we have by focusing on practices that I think, in fact, will empower faithful and truthful and effective ministry. And there are lots of them, aren't there? I mean, of course, there are many different kinds of practices, and I'm just choosing story for a way of helping us, all of us, in our places, better understand ourselves collectively and unearth, extract signs of God's presence and point to the activity of God in our context. So I want to just suggest, actually want to suggest 3 practices of story, and then before we're done and do whatever at the end, if we have a little Q&A, I don't know what we'll have, but I have one quote from Brian McLaren that I want to share. So 3 practices of story that I think can help us when it comes to better understanding ourselves together as God's people. One is dwelling in God's story. And this is certainly not something that needs to happen individually. It can happen collectively. There's all sorts of things that we call dwelling in God's story. Lectio Divina, we call it. Sometimes we call it Bible study. Sometimes we call it small groups. But the point is that as the people of God, in whatever context we inhabit together, our lives are set within a very different story, and I mean capital S, and that's God's story. It calls us, to an alternative vision for our life together, for the future of the world. So dwelling in God's story is a way, I think, to continually immerse ourselves in these narratives that we maybe think we know what they mean, and allow ourselves to be surprised, to be open to the text. And I think of course it's important to do this on our own, as it were, and in our own devotional lives, but it's also important that we do it together. I mean, among others, Luther was quick to caution about the danger of spending too much time reading or studying the Bible by yourself. And so collective practices of dwelling in God's story are helpful. That's a good initial practice, which I then think leads to a second practice, which is the practice of story hearing. Storytelling gets a lot of the limelight, gets a lot of the neon signs, but actually story hearing is always anterior. It's a precedent to storytelling. And so dwelling in God's story is a way of listening. It's a way of listening to God's story, and story hearing also means listening to other person's stories. However it is, we can create opportunities to come together as God's people and to do in what we just did in a tiny little bit, which is just to hear who we are as the people of God, to hear our stories. And it's a very life-giving practice. So dwelling, hearing, and then storytelling and telling the story. Now those two things, you can see I have them separated because they're not the same. I think it's sometimes easy to assume that storytelling and telling the story are the same, but they're not. Telling the story is really telling God's story, telling God's grand story, the Genesis to Revelation, before and beyond story. So storytelling is important, telling the story is important. They're not the same thing. These are and storytelling, or telling the story, whether as a teacher, a communicator, a preacher, a pastor, a diaconal minister, or youth director, whatever it might be, we have to earn the right. I think today we have to earn the right to tell, and we earn it by building trust, by listening, and by dwelling. So those are three practices that I think are really helpful. It's not rocket science, but it does take intentionality. It does take concerted efforts together at deepening our life together with God. So here's my Brian McLaren quote that I think is pretty fun when it comes to the power of story. And Brian years ago talked about there are really three things that stories do. Stories invite participation. The story itself is the point. Like we all know one of the absolute worst things you can do to a good story is to try and explain it. After you tell it, it's like, okay, now let me tell you what I think that means. I mean, the story is, let it stand on its own. So Brian said, the story is the point, stories invite participation. And then finally he said, stories are sneaky. And here's my quote. It's a quote from Brian McLaren. A story doesn't grab you by the lapels and bring you close so that you can smell the garlic and coffee and Altoids on the breath. What a story does is sneak up behind you and whisper something in your ear. And when you turn around to see what it is, it kicks you in the butt and runs and hides, say behind a bush. And in so doing, a story does something that no abstract proposition can ever do. It stops you in your tracks and makes you think. It catches your attention and won't let you go. You can't help it. A story can't be argued with or dismissed like a proposition could. A story is just sneaky. It doesn't teach by induction or deduction. It teaches by abduction. It abducts your attention and won't let you go until you have done some thinking for yourself. I thought that's fun.
I love that. I'm going to share Kari's description of her congregation and their story, and then ask if you just have one closing comment, and then I have a couple announcements to close us out.
Well,
so Kari has been at her current church for 4 years, worked as the youth director throughout college. The congregation is welcoming with service projects, education for children, teens, and adults, and they are faithful and loving. So I wanted to make sure I got everybody's comment in. And I wondered if you had a closing statement, Nate.
Yeah, I have. I'll keep it brief. I have sort of two things. One is more to do with this webinar and this conversation. You can see that my last point there is I just want to be clear that the way I've tried to talk us through culture to context to story, that's just one approach, one way of understanding cultural context. There are lots of different approaches, but the point of this is that I hope it resonates with the call that all of us have to ministry in some way, shape, or form, so that culture just doesn't remain some kind of a nebulous, abstract thing, but rather it has to do with the places we live and move and have our being, and with practices in which we're engaged. The second thing, so that's that piece. And I just want to. This has been really fun, and I've been on and off just imagining all the people who are a part of this right now and listening, and I want to thank everybody for taking the time to join this, and I want to thank you very much for the ministry that you exercise on behalf of God in all these places you've described. And anybody wants to follow up with this or has any questions, Wartburg Seminary, hit me with an email or whatever. I'd be glad to chat.
Wonderful, and thank you for making yourself available. Again, it's Nate Frambach, and you can find him through the Wartburg Seminary website. I'm going to blast through some reminders, and then we will be done with this particular webinar. So just a reminder, it's being recorded and archived at the Practice Discipleship website. That's www.practicediscipleship.org. So please download it, share it with anyone who needs to hear it, volunteers, your church council, adult forums, your colleagues, whoever. You can also download from the Practice Discipleship site videos and curriculum from last year's theme, which was Youth Ministry at the Crossroads. Those also can be used in your congregation and networks. Each synod in the ELCA has a Practice Discipleship coach who's been trained to offer seminars on these webinars locally in your own synod. So training events are posted at that same website, practicediscipleship.org. Our next webinar is scheduled for February 17th at 3 p.m. Central. The title is Working Together in Solidarity with Rosella White. You can register by going to practicediscipleship.org. The webinars are held every 2 weeks if you want to get them onto your calendar. You're invited also to join the next third Tuesday congregation on February 19th at 1 p.m. Central with Dr. Andy Root. His book, Taking Theology to Youth Ministry, is the focus for this year's Practice Discipleship initiative. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you again, Nate.
Oh, yeah, more than happy to. You all be well and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you. Have a great day. Goodbye.